So in the last tutorial, we basically created our couple of pages, the front facing pages. And then in this lecture, what we are going to do is basically we are going to cover the register part. So inside the registration part, we are basically going to create users into our application. Now, before actually we do that, we first have to define a couple of roles on the backend. So the roles are basically required in order to make sure like which person is basically trying to create an account. Either it is an instructor that is trying to create an account or a student. Okay. And definitely we will also have a role for admin as well. So we need to define the certain roles in our either on dashboard or our in enums. Okay. So what I'm going to do is basically before we actually start working on that, so we need to first cover these modules, sorry, these routes. So protect these routes for our middleware. So in the middleware, I will apply them as a guest middleware. So let's currently use this auth and replace it by guest. Okay. And the other thing I also want to do is basically I want to apply the throttle as well. Sorry, the throttle middleware. Now the reason is that because I want to make sure that no user tries to basically send the unlimited request to these URLs. All right, so that's the first point. Now the second thing is basically we need to basically define the roles. So as I earlier mentioned that we will have three roles. The one will be admin, the second one will be the tutor, and the last one will be the student. Okay, so let's define those roles. So the first thing is we can do is basically we can define the role within our database. That's the first option. And the second option it could be is that we define the roles for within our enum classes. Okay, so I guess the best way of doing is to define the enum classes. So what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to create a class, and I will name it as I will create it within enums, and inside that I will name it as role. Okay, so roles, that's a good name. um, okay, so it should be yes, we also want to do that. So the proper command was php artisan make dash class. So now if you go into the app directory and inside the enums, you will see that we do have the enums directory created, and inside that we have enums. Okay, now the first thing that I would want to do is basically I will return um, and sorry, I will create the constant admin for one, and I will define the tutor for let's say two, and lastly for student let's define three. Or it's totally up to us how you want to basically do that. You can make it more secure. So one, two, three is basically is a good option. Okay, so we have defined our roles here, and this is basically an enum class. So let's get started with now with our registration process. So we also need to make a couple of changes in our database structure. So the first thing is basically we need to have the role of the user. So we will define it by just saying role ID. And secondly, we will also have a couple of other options. So we first need to change this name to first name and last name, and then we will also add some other options later on in our series. So first of all, let's do that. So let's open our user underscore tables directory, sorry, migration. So we have string of name, so we'll have first name and then we will use last name. We will also have email, and we will also have the username as well. And on the top, I will also declare the role underscore ID, and that will be the integer. And definitely it will also be indexed as well. Okay. So first name, last name, username, email, and definitely the password. The other thing is I would also like to mention here is we also need to create an integer for the user status. So I will name it as active, and the default value would be 1. Okay, so by default the user will be active. Or maybe we can set it to 0. So we need to make sure that the user account is verified. So we will also verify the account as well. Okay, so let's run the migrations. So where we are. Okay, so PHP artisan migrate fresh. All right, so let's refresh our database, and now we see the role ID, first name, last name, username, password, and active status as well. All right, so let's get started. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to change this process, basically the input fields here. So I will start by first name, and that is first name. Then after first name, we will have the last name, and definitely change our IDs and name for last name as well. Now, there is one more thing I would like to do here is for the value, we also need to get the original value if there is any sort of issue. Okay. Uh, any sort of issue, what I mean is basically that if there is any validation error. So username definitely will be generated automatically. We need the email, password, um, and for the email, we also need to use this value here and use the email. And lastly, password. And the important thing that is required is either we are registering as a student or as a tutor. Okay, so let's basically make it maybe after the or at the very top here. So what we need for that is basically I would like to show the two radio buttons. Um, that will indicate that if we are a student or a tutor. Okay, so let me grab those radio buttons from the HTML theme. All right, so now we have the input field of radio button. So I will name it as role, and the type will be radio, and the value we are going to basically get the value from role enums, and I will use this for, okay, so the first one will be our tutor. Okay, so we will make it as tutor, and the second one we are going to do for our student. Or maybe what we can do is basically we can use the first one as a student and make it a checkbox, and then the second one we can make it tutor, and definitely we can not check it. Okay, so if we take a look at here, so we have student and tutor. Okay, and then definitely we also need to show these in one line. So let's also apply a little class on that. So tflex, and let's use that, and also use justify content between. Now if I reload the page, so here we can see or maybe we don't need to do that, just use deflex and a cap of, let's say, 3. Okay, so now we have student and tutor. So for the student, we can use basically different colors here. So let me also check this. So this will be named as radio, role for student, and role for tutor. And we also need to check this primary to, let's say, success. Now if I reload the page and click on that, so yeah, that works perfectly. Okay, so now we have these two options here. We also need to make this at the rate checked if the old value, which is basically role, is equals to this one. Okay, so we will make it checked, and also we need to make this one checked if definitely the role is now Twitter. All right, so and we can also specify the default role for that as well. So we can specify the default role of student. Now if we refresh, we now have student selected. All right, so let's now create an endpoint and definitely register our user. So what I am going to do is basically let's create a function, sorry, the web endpoint, make it a post, and so that will definitely be posted on register page, and we are going to name it as register and definitely name register here as well. And inside our HTML form, we need to change the action. So the action would be route, and inside the route, we are going to use the name. And we also need to make sure that we are adding the CSRF token. All right. And one more thing, lastly, we need to create a function of, let's rename this to register, and dump and die the request all method to see what we are actually getting. Refresh the page. I have the fake filler extension, so I'm going to use that and click on sign up. And let's see if that works. Okay, so it says call to undefined method of register. Okay, so the issue is because we are using on password forgot controller, not the exact appropriate controller. So now if I fill the form again, submit, now we can see that we now have the role, name, email, and password. All right. So what else we need is basically the first thing that I would like to do is create a form request class. So PHP artisan make a request and register request. And I am going to use the register request here. And inside that, I will authorize this to true. And okay, so we can also apply certain conditions here, definitely. But let's authorize this to true. The first thing that I'm going to check is for our role. Okay, so the role should be required. It should be integer. It should be exist. Okay, so it should be in and inside that we need to provide the roles. Okay, so what we can do is basically, since we have defined our roles in enum class and we have 2 and 3, so we need to use these 2 and 3 roles here. Okay, the second thing, we can now go for the first name, definitely required string, last name, and then we can also need the email. So that will be required string, email, maximum, and unique in users. Okay, and lastly we need password, and we do not need to use the confirmation, and definitely minimum of 8 characters. Now once all the validations are completed, we can now try to register our user. So the first thing that I'm going to do is basically I will be using try catch block, and inside the catch what I'm going to do is basically query exception, and then the exception. Okay, within this register controller, so I want to see if we have any service classes. No, so let's create a service class. So PHP artisan make a class services register class, or sorry, not register class, it should be register service, and we have those services here. Delete this register class, so we need to basically use this register service. So let me remove everything from here, and the first thing what I'm going to do is basically I will use protected object of register, and I will create a constructor function, and I will use this here, or maybe we can use this service name and just use this service to this register, or also just replace the register by using service. Okay, now inside our try catch block, the first thing that I'm going to do is basically we need, if there is any error, we need to log that error, and we can definitely log the entire error. Secondly, I am going to redirect back with errors, and definitely we are basically having the, let me see, do we have authentication errors defined? No, we do not have that. So let's quickly go to our resources views, and let's create a new directory and name it as errors. And inside these errors, I am going to create the PHP class, and I will name it as errors.blade. And inside that, I will paste the errors HTML. Okay, so the first one, this will definitely check if there are any errors. So this will display the errors. Then we will have the response. So definitely instead of that, let's use error. So if we have any error, we are going to display the error. If we have any success, we are going to display the success. So what we need to do is basically we need to just import that by referencing errors underscore errors, and back to our controller. So we are going to return redirect with input, the first thing, and then with, and for that I will use error and $e get message, this one. Okay, so once this if everything works fine, what I will do is I will basically use this service, register function. Let's create a function of register, and inside that we are going to create a user. So within our users model, what we need is, let's remove this factory. Instead of fillable, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to use guard because I want that everything should be fillable. I do not want to specify any certain columns. That's the first thing and only thing that we want to change here. And then return user create, and inside that let's define an array, and first name should be $request input first dash name, and definitely we have the first name, um, like so how we defined it, first underscore name. Then we are going to duplicate this for our last name. Then we have email, and we also need to use the password. So the password should be encrypted. So we are going to use password hash class. Actually not password hash, it should be hash and make. Okay. Um, Definitely we need to generate the username. So for the username, let's create a protected function of username and pass this a request. And inside that, let's get the first name and last name, and then create a slug of str title, sorry, str slug, and inside that let's use first name and last name. Okay, now what we need is basically we now need to check um, that we need to basically find user where um, we need to use username like, and we need to use this slug. So the initial one will be basically like, so we need to check if the username already exists. Okay, so what we can do is basically we can check by using this command, so the slug that this will generate, and definitely we will use this at the ampersand column in sign at the very end. The reason is that because we want to name it as, for example, if the user is already existed and the username is this one like this, we want to append this by 1 or 2 or 3. So we need to make this thing iteratable. So this thing should be checked if there is anything else other than this one. So we have to definitely return the user name properly. So what we can do is basically if there is any user, so what we need to do is basically um, we need to return the slug, and we need to basically use we can use any option here, and we can also use random numbers, so with like 0 to 9. But instead of that, what I am going to do is basically I am going to um, basically check how many users are there, and we will basically count those users, and then we will append the username at the very end. Okay, So what for that reason, what we need is basically instead of using the first, what we can do is basically we can use the count method. So for that, what we can check if the user is greater than 0. Okay, so what we can do now is we can return this slug by users count to 1. Okay, um, else we can return this slug. Okay, like so. And let's also basically minify this operation by using the ternary operator, else we are going to return our slug. And let's remove these options, and this will definitely return a string here. All right, so let me explain you what it is doing. So we are checking if there are any users with this username, count those users, how many are there. So if the user is greater than 0, okay, so what we are doing is basically we are um, using this slug, and then we are appending with by dash and appending the user and adding it 1, otherwise it will return this slug. Okay, so that's pretty simple. So lastly we need to use the username, and for the username we are going to target the username, and let's also pass the request object here as well. All right, now if everything goes well, what we also need to do is basically we are going to use the transactions, and we are going to use the commit. So the purpose of transactions is basically the transactions will make sure that the user, either all the records have been inserted properly or not. If they are not inserted properly, definitely we will roll back the transactions. So in order to roll back the transaction, what we need is basically we need to use db rollback, okay, in our catch block. And then if everything goes well, what we can do is basically we can return back with our success message, and inside that we can say successfully registered. Okay, and let's try that. Obviously we need to now check one more thing I would like to do is basically I would like to make sure that this is a redirect response. Okay, and let's try to check if everything is working properly. We are basically missing one thing, which is basically the role ID of the user. So we need to make sure that the user role does exist. So let's use the fake filler and try to submit, and let's see what we are getting. Okay, so it says that the user has been successfully registered. Now if we take a look at our user section, and here we have user role ID of 3. So we have the student role ID, definitely 3. We also have the first name, last name, the username is generated, email is there, and the password is there, and the by default status is 0, it is not active. All right, so in this lecture we basically registered the user. In the next lecture we are basically going to um, make sure that when the user is registered, we send an email to verify the user account, because we want to verify the user email, and we also set the user active status to 1 as well. Okay, so if none of this works, we will not allow the user to log in to the dashboard pages. All right, so that's it for this section, and I will see you in the next one.